You know? Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying these untold Hollywood secrets, please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking celebrity revelations. Your support means the world to us. Now let's get into this amazing story. It was September 22nd, 1967, and the Hollywood Bowl was packed with 12,000 people waiting to see Doris Day's first major concert performance in over 3 years. The audience was buzzing with excitement. This was America's sweetheart's triumphant return to live performance after focusing on movies and television. Doris had just finished a beautiful rendition of Secret Love and was transitioning into K Sarah Sarah when something happened that nobody in that amphitheater would ever forget. From somewhere in the middle section, a loud, slurred voice cut through the music and the crowd's applause like a knife through silk. "Doris Day, you're nothing but a phony." The voice belonged to 42-year-old construction worker Frank Bulldozer Murphy from downtown Los Angeles, who had been drinking at a nearby bar since noon. Bulldozer wasn't just drunk, he was angry, bitter, and looking for someone to blame for all the disappointments in his life. What happened next would become one of the most beautiful moments in entertainment history, proving that true strength doesn't come from fighting back. It comes from fighting for someone who can't fight for themselves. Now, let me back up here and tell you about Frank Murphy, because understanding his pain makes what Doris did next even more incredible. Frank had been having the worst year of his life. His wife of 15 years had left him, taking their 2 young daughters with her. He'd lost his job at the construction site after showing up drunk too many times. In his alcohol-fogged mind, Frank had convinced himself that celebrities like Doris Day represented everything that was wrong with the world: fake happiness, false promises, and people who had never faced real hardship. "She's up there singing about sunshine and rainbows," Frank had told his drinking buddies earlier that day, "while real people are suffering in the real world." Frank had bought a ticket to Doris's concert not because he was a fan, but because he wanted to prove his point that these Hollywood types were all show and no substance. "I'm going to show everyone what a fraud she really is," he had slurred to anyone who would listen. But Frank was about to learn that sometimes the people we think we know the least are the ones who understand us the most. When Frank's voice rang out across the Hollywood Bowl, calling Doris a phony, the entire amphitheater went silent. The orchestra stopped playing. 12,000 people turned to stare at this swaying, aggressive man who was now standing in his seat, pointing accusingly at the stage. Doris's first reaction was exactly what any professional performer would do. She tried to handle the situation with grace and humor. "Well, hello there," Doris said into her microphone, her voice carrying that warm maternal tone that had made her America's sweetheart. "It looks like we have someone who wants to join our little musical family tonight." The audience laughed nervously, hoping this would diffuse the situation. But Frank wasn't interested in being charmed. "Don't you hello there, me lady," Frank shouted, his voice echoing off the bowl's walls. "You stand up there in your fancy dress, singing about how everything's going to be okay, but you don't know anything about real life. You've never had to worry about paying rent or keeping a job or watching your family fall apart." The atmosphere in the bowl changed immediately. This wasn't just a drunk causing a disturbance. This was raw pain being screamed at one of the most beloved figures in America. Security guards began moving toward Frank's section, but Doris did something that surprised everyone. She held up her hand, stopping the security team in their tracks. "Wait," she said firmly. "Let him speak. Actually, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where Doris showed everyone what real strength looks like." Instead of having Frank removed, instead of ignoring him and continuing with her show, Doris Day did something that no one expected. She sat down on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling like a little girl, and looked directly at Frank with the kind of attention most people reserve for their closest friends. "You're right," she said simply. "I am wearing a fancy dress and I am up here singing songs. But you know what? I think you and I might have more in common than you think." Frank was so surprised by this response that he almost sat down. "Almost. You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "Maybe I don't," Doris replied, "but I'd like to." "What's your name?" The question, asked with such genuine interest, seemed to catch Frank completely off guard. "Frank," he said. Uncertainly. Frank, Doris repeated warmly. That's a strong name. A good name. Frank, can I tell you something about fancy dresses and stages and singing songs? Frank didn't answer, but he didn't interrupt either. I've been wearing fancy dresses and standing on stages for over 20 years, Doris continued. And you want to know a secret? Every single night before I go on stage, I'm scared. Scared that people won't like me. Scared that I'll forget the words. Scared that I'm not good enough. The entire amphitheater was hanging on every word. And you know why I'm scared, Frank? Because underneath this fancy dress, I'm just a girl from Cincinnati who's been through some hard times too. Doris stood up and walked closer to where Frank was standing. I've been divorced, Frank, twice. I've been broke. I've been betrayed by people I trusted. I've cried myself to sleep wondering how I was going to pay my bills and take care of my son. Frank's aggressive posture began to soften. So when I stand up here and sing about sunshine and hope, it's not because my life has been easy. It's because I've learned that sometimes, when everything seems dark, the only thing that gets you through is believing that tomorrow might be better. Don't forget to comment below and let us know what other heartwarming celebrity moments you'd like to hear about. The transformation happening in Frank was visible to everyone in the bowl. His shoulders had dropped, his fists had unclenched, and tears were beginning to form in his eyes. Frank, Doris said gently, what's really hurting you tonight? What brought you here? The question, asked with such maternal tenderness, broke something open in Frank. In front of 12,000 people, this tough construction worker started to cry. My wife left me, he said, his voice breaking. She took my little girls, said I was a drunk and a failure, and that they'd be better off without me. The amphitheater was completely silent, except for Frank's words. And maybe she's right. Maybe they are better off. I lost my job, I can't stop drinking, and I don't know how to fix anything anymore. Doris's eyes filled with tears as she listened to this man's pain. Oh, Frank, she said softly. I'm so sorry. Losing your children. There's no pain like that in the world. She turned to address the entire audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet my new friend Frank. He's going through one of the hardest times anyone can face, and he had the courage to tell us about it. The audience, instead of being annoyed by this disruption to their evening, began to applaud, not sarcastically, but with genuine warmth and support. Frank, Doris said, I want to ask you something. Do you love your daughters? More than anything in the world, Frank replied without hesitation. And do you want to be the kind of father they can be proud of? Yes, Frank said, crying harder now, but I don't know how. What Doris did next became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Then let's start right here, right now, she said, in front of all these people who are rooting for you. She gestured to her band leader. Boys, can you give us a gentle version of You Are My Sunshine? As the soft melody began, Doris extended her hand to Frank. Frank, I want you to come up here with me. I want you to sing this song, and I want you to think about your daughters while you're singing it. Frank looked terrified. I can't sing, especially not in front of all these people. You don't have to be good at it, Doris said with a smile. You just have to mean it, and I'll help you. Reluctantly, with the encouragement of the people around him, Frank made his way to the stage. When he climbed up, Doris took his arm gently and led him to the microphone. This song is for Frank's daughters, she announced to the crowd, and for every parent who's trying to find their way back to their children's hearts. What happened next left 12,000 people in tears. Frank began to sing, You Are My Sunshine, his voice shaky and off-key, but filled with more emotion than any professional performance could ever contain. When he forgot the words, Doris whispered them to him. When his voice broke, she sang harmony to support him. When he started to give up, she squeezed his hand and encouraged him to continue. By the time they reached the final verse, Please don't take my sunshine away, there wasn't a dry eye in the Hollywood Bowl. The audience gave Frank a standing ovation that lasted for 5 full minutes. Frank, Doris said, when the applause finally died down, do you hear that? That's 12,000 people telling you that you matter, that your love for your daughters matter. and that it's never too late to become the man you want to be. But Doris wasn't finished. She turned to the audience and said something that would be remembered for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight Frank taught us something important. He taught us that behind every angry person is usually someone who's hurting. Behind every person who lashes out is usually someone who feels powerless. Frank didn't come here tonight to hurt me or disrupt our show. He came here because he's in pain and he doesn't know where else to turn. How many of us have felt that way? How many of us have wanted to scream at the world when everything seems to be falling apart? The audience was completely absorbed in every word. But Frank also showed us something else. He showed us that it takes courage to be vulnerable, to admit when you're hurting, to ask for help. Doris put her arm around Frank's shoulder. And that's why I'm going to make Frank a promise, right here in front of all of you. Frank, I'm going to help you find a job. I'm going to help you find someone to talk to about your drinking. And I'm going to help you figure out how to win back your daughter's trust. The audience erupted in applause again, because that's what we do for each other. Doris continued, we don't tear each other down when we're struggling. We lift each other up. Frank stayed for the rest of the concert, sitting on the side of the stage, occasionally joining in when Doris invited him to sing backup vocals. By the end of the evening, he had gone from being the show's biggest disruption to being part of its most memorable moments. True to her word, Doris followed through on her promises. She helped Frank find a job with a construction company owned by one of her friends. She connected him with a counselor who specialized in helping people overcome alcohol addiction, and she personally called Frank's ex-wife to tell her about what had happened at the concert. Mrs. Murphy, Doris had said, I met your husband tonight, and I want you to know that he loves those girls more than life itself. He's got some problems to work through, but I've never seen anyone more motivated to change. Frank's wife agreed to let him start having supervised visits with his daughters again. The story of Doris Day and Frank Murphy spread across the country within days, becoming a legendary example of how to handle conflict with grace, compassion, and wisdom. But for Doris, the incident meant something much deeper. That night taught me what my real job is, Doris said later. It's not just to entertain people, it's to remind people that they're not alone, that they matter, and that there's always hope. Frank Murphy got sober, rebuilt his relationship with his daughters, and eventually remarried his ex-wife. He credited that night at the Hollywood Bowl with saving his life. Doris Day saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, Frank said years later. She saw a father who loved his children instead of just a drunk who was causing trouble. She turned the worst night of my life into the beginning of a better life. The incident became a turning point for Doris as well. She began incorporating more direct audience interaction into her performances, always looking for opportunities to connect with people who seemed to be struggling. After that night with Frank, I realized that every person in my audience is fighting some kind of battle, Doris explained. My job is to help them feel a little less alone in that fight. The story of Doris Day and the Heckler became a parable about the power of compassion to transform conflict. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, Doris chose to meet it with curiosity and kindness. She turned a potential confrontation into a healing experience, a hostile interruption into a moment of grace, and an enemy into a friend. Doris proved that night that you don't defeat your enemies by fighting them, said civil rights leader Dorothy Height. You defeat them by loving them until they remember how to love themselves. Today, the story is taught in conflict resolution courses and cited by therapists as an example of how to respond to anger with empathy. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story is what happened years later. In 1985, when Frank's eldest daughter got married, she sent Doris an invitation to the wedding. You gave me my father back, she wrote in the accompanying note. I want you to be there when I promise to love someone the way he learned to love us. Doris attended the wedding, and Frank walked his daughter down the aisle sober, proud, and surrounded by family who had forgiven him because he had learned to forgive himself. The confrontation between Doris Day and Frank Murphy reminds us that behind every act of aggression is usually a person in pain, and it shows us that the strongest response to hostility isn't more hostility. It's understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see the humanity in everyone. Doris could have had Frank thrown out. She could have ignored him. She could have used her power and position to humiliate him. Instead, she chose to help him, to heal him, and to show 12,000 people what real strength looks like. Not the strength to defeat your enemies, but the strength to turn them into friends. That's why, more than 50 years later, people still talk about the night Doris Day transformed a Heckler into a hero. It wasn't just great entertainment, it was great humanity. And in a world that often seems divided by anger and misunderstanding, maybe that's exactly the kind of story we need to hear. The story of someone who chose compassion over conflict, understanding over judgment, and love over fear. That's the power of kindness. That's the power of seeing people as they could be instead of as they are. That's the power of being America's sweetheart, not because you're perfect, but because you help other people believe they can be better than they are. Doris Day understood that. Frank Murphy learned that. And for one magical night at the Hollywood Bowl, 12,000 other people witnessed what happens when grace meets pain and transforms it into hope. Sometimes the most beautiful performances happen when the music stops and the love begins. Doris Day knew that better than anyone, and that's why her legacy isn't just about the songs she sang or the movies she made. It's about the lives she touched and the hearts she healed. One person at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, one drunk construction worker at a time. Because that's what love does. It doesn't just entertain, it transforms.